ערב טוב.
Hi, Rabbi. How are you?
Good evening. Baruch Hashem, thank you. Okay. So looks like we're doing Daled. So says the two like this. אף על פי שאין טומנים בשבת, אפילו בדבר שאין מוסיף עליו. Even though we're not allowed to insulate on Shabbat, even something which doesn't have heat. אם טמן בהם מבעוד יום, but if he did actually do it, right, anyway, ונתגלה, so what he's saying is like this, right, if he did the installation before Shabbat, and then it got opened up, as we said, right, you want to serve it, you're allowed to come back and cover it again. Even if it's already Shabbat. וכן יכול לגלותו בשבת ולחזור ולחסותו באור. So he says also he's allowed to open it on Shabbat and close it again. או להוסיף עליו בשבת, or to add on it more on Shabbat, add more. או אפילו ליטול כולה, or to take everything off, וליתן אחר במקומו, and then put another one instead, in its place. בין ש... בין שהבית אחד מהראשון, whether it's hotter than the first one, or it's colder, doesn't matter. ובלבד שנתבשלה כדרה כל צורכה, but it has to be that the dish is fully cooked. אבל אם לא נתבשלה כל צורכה, but if it's not fully cooked, אפילו להוסיף על כיסוי, למה אסור? You're not allowed to add on it either. No cover. שבתוספת זו גורם לה להתבשל. Because by adding more, you're causing it to cook. אבל אם גילה מבעוד יום, but if he uncovered it, right, before Shabbat, על דעתה שלא לכסותו, with the intention of not to cover it again, גורם, Asur lechasoto, you're not allowed to cover it. Once it gets dark, once it becomes Shabbat. So that which we say, right, that it's forbidden to insulate on Shabbat with something that doesn't add heat. That's talking about in the pot that it was cooked in. But if he removed the dish, right, and put it into a different pot, he's allowed to insulate it there. But so then mutar, guys, so that's the thing, once you move it to a different pot, you're allowed to do insulation, even on Shabbat. Okay, so that's the tour. Let's see, Shbet Yosef, what we got. Says Bet Yosef, Kamar im mitgala beze pashut sham. So he says, what we're saying is that if it got opened, right, you can close it back up, the insulation. The Mishnah lo kisao mibedyon. It says in the Mishnah, if you didn't cover it right before Shabbat, lo yichasenu b'shetech hashachar. Don't cover it when it gets dark. Kisao nitgala, if it was covered and it got opened, mutar lechasato. You're allowed to cover it again. So then it says, "V'chen yakol legaloto b'Shabbat." Also, you're allowed to open it on Shabbat and close it, right? L'chazor chasoto. V'chen mash katav, and also what he wrote, "Aval im gilab mibe'od yom." If you opened it before Shabbat, adata shelo l'chazor, with the intention of not to close it again, asur l'chasoto. You're not allowed to close it. Kumi mash katav tatvot tasvot. That's what it says in Tosfot. The Rabbi says, I'm sorry, the Rosh. The Rosh. Okay. Sham kisau nidgala. It says there that if he covered it and it got opened again, you're allowed to cover it again. So it seems also that he's allowed to open it and to uncover it with his hands, and also to close it now back up. Just like you're allowed to take the pot altogether and return it. That which he used this language. He covered it and it got open. Mishum nidgala mibe'od yom ayre. It's talking about that it got opened up before revealed or before Shabbat. Dumya deresha, like similar to the beginning. Avalim gilau be'adayim, but if he opened it with his hands, be'odom before Shabbat, hidesha lo ayre lechasoto, in order not to close it, to cover it again. Mishetechashach, if it's dark. Asur lechasoto mishetechashach. So then it's forbidden to close it once it gets dark. Okay. Because that's considered to be like a new insulation, not a continuation of the old one. That's what it says in Yerucham. Over there, so it says, right, that you're allowed to cover it once it gets dark. Gila unless he opened it before Shabbat. With the intention not to close it when it gets dark. About Samak v'Samak. But he says these two rabbis, והתרומה, so this guy, כתבו דחול שנתגלה ועוד יום, they wrote that if it was open before Shabbat, אסור לחסותו משתחשך, then you're not to close it on Shabbat. That's why I use the language of opening, revealing. בדיעבד, it's like בדיעבד, the so it's coming to describe, right, דווקא נתגלה משתחשך, we're talking about only if it got opened when it was already Shabbat. אבל נתגלה בעוד יום, but if it was opened before Shabbat, אפילו ממילא אסור לחסותו. So then, even by itself, right, if you get open by itself, you're not allowed to cover it, משתחשך once it gets dark. דאח איתה, בירושלמי, that's what it says in ירושלמי. Okay. Okay, long story here. So we'll take it little by little. Okay, let's move on. So it says, "V'ken yireh midibri Rambam." That's what it seems also from Rambam. Perek Dalet, halacha Dalet. V'hagaot is kirosh shetei asvarot. So it says the Hagaot Maimoniot. They mention these two opinions. V'lo yichlu. They didn't paskin, which is the halacha. וכן שרוב הפוסקים לחומרה והרמב"ם מכללם. Right? So it says since most of the poskim are going stringent, and also the Rambam is included there. The Yerushalmi is saying, and also Yerushalmi supports that. So therefore, it says proper to be stringent here to forbid this. So it says, and then I'm going to explain later on. If there's one that forbids to open it Shabbat and to cover it, right? Is anybody who forbids that too? Okay. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to get some water. Okay, let's move on. So it says Mash katab o leosif alav b'Shabbat. That's what you said, right? That or to add to it on Shabbat, or afilu litlo kulo, or uh, to take the whole thing, take off the whole thing and then put another one instead. So we said you're allowed to do that. So it says regarding that, Bet Yosef, Sopek Mamen Tamlin. So it says over there in this Gemara, Nun Aleph Amud Aleph, in Shabbat, Tan Rabbanan, right? The rabbis taught there in the Braita, even though we said, right, that you're not allowed to insulate in something which, even if it doesn't add heat on the Shabbat, but if it's coming to add more, and we'll see if you can do that. That's okay. Ketzad, how so? Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, this rabbi says, Omer notel hasadinin umaniach hagluf karin. He says, right, that what you do is you take off the blankets, and instead, right, you put some other material on it. Right? Whatever it is, you're changing the material. Here's Rashi says, explains, gluf karin, right? Yesh bo hebel yoter me'asadinin. Oh, so he says, right, this gluf karin, it has more heat than the sheets. So meaning what? That, as we said, right, there are certain materials that tend to increase heat, so this is more like increasing the heat than does the sheets. And he takes the mimot hachama, or the other way around, right? He could be removing the hot one and putting a cooler one. He's afraid that the dish is going to get dried out, like it's burned. So he wants to reduce it. So then he goes on, we got Tosfot Katu, says Tosfot, the Logasinam Kitzad. So he says, we don't have a text over there, like Kitzad Derashbag Pali Atanakama. Doesn't say there that the Rashbag argues with Tanakama, the first opinion. The Lo Shar Ela Leosif, that it's only allowed to add, but he forbids to change it altogether, to switch it. The Chen Dat Samag Smak, also the rabbis Pasku, Alacha Tanakama. They also pass make first opinion. Aval Arosh Katav. The Rosh says, Rabbeinu Yonah Mekayem Girsat Asfarim. So I'll read that again. Abala Rosh Kata, but the Rosh said, Rabbeinu Yonah, that Rabbeinu Yonah Mekam Gisat Sfarim. He holds on, right? He maintains the text of the books, the Grasinan Kitzad Berashbag, that says the word Kitzad, right? Which means how so. Okay. So The Rashbag lo ba lachalok al Tanakama. And Rashbag is not coming to argue with the first opinion, ela lefaresh debar, he's just coming to explain it. Ketzad, how so? Im ba leosif, osif. If he's coming to add, he can add. Lo mi amrinan, lo shalinan leosif. Do we say that we don't allow to add, ela imken kisat techila, unless he covered it first? Davar amshamer choman yafe, something which retains the heat well. Kagon roof covering, right? Like this material, which, as we said, right, it's warmer than the sheets. Or dilma apilu kisau b'davar kal, or even if perhaps he covered it with something light, kagon sadinin, like like sheets. Shen mishtamer chuman. So there, right, there's not much. It doesn't guard the heat well. Doesn't hold on to it. כל כך. כיוון דמהנה כלשהו כיסהו מבעוד יום. Since, right, it suffices, right, that he covered it before Shabbat. So we consider it to be like before Shabbat. Rashbag explains, since he said that he takes the sheets, so you see from there that he considers that he covered it right before Shabbat, even with sheets. And that which Rashbag concluded, that he takes these gluf karin, telling you something, and I don't need to tell you that. In other words, it's all the more so. That's how the Rif also has it in his text. And the Ram says the Ran, Notel et Asadinin, takes the sheets. Ashmina and the Tarte teaches you two things here. Chada de lo mibaya ve'im ba leosif masif. One is, I don't need to tell you that if he wants to add, he could add. But not only that, but even if he took whatever he put, he totally removed it. Before Shabbat, that resembles, he says, like somebody who insulates lechatchila. This is also another thing, which is that even though it wasn't insulated from the beginning, just with a sheet, it's considered like it's open. The sheet doesn't really do much. Nevertheless, it's mutar, it's allowed. That's what it says in Yisham Perek Dalet. וכן דעת רבנו ירוחם, that's what it says in רבנו ירוחם, בספר התרומה והגעת סמ"ק. Also in these books, וגם סמ"ק חזר וכתב, so it says also סמ"ק, right, said, he wrote, the מסתבר דהלכה כדברי המקל. So he says, makes sense to say that we should go like the lenient opinion. כתב רב מגיד, ושכן דעת הרמב"ן. He says also the Ramban holds this way. The Rashba also the Shechin Data, the Zilashon Rambam Perek Dalet. What about the Rambam? What does he say? It says, Putar umutar lechalifa kisui. You're allowed to cover the, you're allowed to switch the change. The cover, b'Shabbat and Shabbat. Kitzad, how so? Notel kisut v'maniach kanfei yonah. For instance, right, you can take out the clothing, or remove that, and instead put the wings of the feathers of the pigeon. Oh, notel kanfei yonah maniach kisut. Or the other way around. Katav Ramagid, says Ramagid, Alav Sheniret Midvarav, seems from his words he says, שרשב"ג בא לפרש, the Rashbag is coming to explain the words of Tanakama, שלא התירו להוסיף, they didn't allow to add to it, אלא על ידי חילוף הכיסוי, unless you switch the cover, בטוב ממנו, something which is better, something which is superior. Okay. So אבל להוסיף כיסוי אסור, but it says just to add more cover is forbidden. ולי נראה שאין בדבריו ככרעה. So it says, it seems to me that there is no conclusion there, right, with these words. In other words, it's not so convincing. So it's possible, he says, really, that it was more fitting, and it should be more fitting to forbid, right, to switch the cover, to put something better, more so than that to forbid to add more covers, al kisui, one on the top of the other. Next explain around. And also the Rabbeinu. Rabbeinu, this is Rambam. No, it's the tour, I'm sorry. So anyway, so it says, if so, the Rambam that that states that it's allowed the Khalifa Kisui to switch the cover, the Tobimin, with something which is better than it. He's telling you something more novel. So from there you learn all the more so you're allowed to add more cover al kisui, right, one on top of the other. So he says, since the words of the Rambam are not so clear one way or the other, so he says, therefore we should go the lenient opinion. Okay. Okay, we've got 5 more minutes with this one. So then he goes on. The Dash Katav Rosh, he says, you should know that Rosh wrote that the Divrei Tosfot Shem Barshim, the Rashbag, the words of the according to Tosfot who explains that the Rashbag Paliga Tanakama, the Rashbag argues with Tanakama, Matnitin the Katana Kisao Manit Gala. Mishnah that teaches that if he covered it and opened it, you're allowed to cover it again. He says we can explain that by saying that it got opened, it's b'diavad. But lechatchila you shouldn't open it like that. In order that Mishnah should go like the Tanna Kama. So he says they forced this, right? Shehu mefaresh divrahim the Tanna Kama lo share, that he explains their words. The Tanna Kama only allows ela leosif lebad, only to add. Aval asur legalato lechalif, but you're not allowed to open it up, right, and change it. ויש לי תמוה שהרי התוספות כתבו, so he says there is a wonder, because the Tosfot wrote, דרי מפרש דרשב"ג פליג התנא קמא. So Tosfot said that the Ri explains that Rashbag argues in Tanna Kama, v'hen katvu, and they wrote, דרי מפרש דמותר לגלתו בידיים, that the Ri explains that you're allowed to open it with your hands. And also to cover it. These rabbis also said that Rashbag argues with the first opinion. So he says that we pass like the first opinion. So therefore they said that you're allowed to open it, right, to uncover it with the hands. So therefore it seems he says that according to Tosfot, Tanna Kama lo share, the Tanna Kama only allows ela leosif, only when you're adding, and not when you're changing it altogether. Says because since he's insulating the pot, the dish, lo share ela leosif, it's only allowed to add, but lo leachalif, and not to change it. So he says because when he insulates the pot with clothing, that they were not there before Shabbat, and now it's open. So that's considered to be like the beginning of the installation. Mishum hachi asur. So it says because of this, it's forbidden. But to open it and then close it and cover it again. With the clothing itself, it's allowed. Even the lo mixer kitchilat atmana doesn't, because it doesn't look like the beginning of atmana. Velo aladat ri. So he says therefore the Ri wouldn't have thought to say that le'asor legalato, to forbid, right, and to open it lachazor chasot and then close it to davar pashut. So he says because it's obvious. Haya etzlo, that's it was obvious by him. The shara that's allowed. Kemo shemutar litol lakdera, just like you're allowed to take the pot and then to open it and to return it. Like it says Tasod. Okay. One more paragraph here. It says, and that which the Torah said, right, that's only if it was fully cooked. That's what's in the Samag. So he said like this, right? Since it gets dark, asur leosif kisui, you're not allowed to add a cover. Afilu ala kdera, even on the pot, she'ena meushelet, which is not cooked. It's not fully cooked. Even though the dish itself, right, is like 1/3 cooked. Kisui b'Shabbat. It's because when you have the additional cover on Shabbat, that's considered like you're cooking. That's what it says in the Smak. והתרומה, this rabbi also, והזכירו בהגאות בפרק ג'. And this rabbi mentions it over there in פרק ג'. Okay, so that's a long story. Let's see if we can do the Shulchan Aruch here. Daled. So it says here, אף על פי שאין טומנים בשבת אפילו בדבר שאין מוסיף עליו. Even though, right, we're not allowed to insulate on Shabbat, even with something which doesn't have heat, אם טמן בו מבעוד יום, but if he, right, insulated it before Shabbat, נתגלה מישהו חשיכה, and then it got open, right, on Shabbat. מותר לחזור ולחסור, you're allowed to recover it again. So why is that? Because it's like, you're just continuing the original insulation. It's not something new there. וכן אם רצה להוסיף עליו בשבת. Also, if he wanted to, right, add on Shabbat more, we'll see if he's allowed to do that too. So two things, right? If it got open, he can close it. The insulation. And also, if he wants to add more, he can add more. Because adding more is like, you're just continuing the same process. It's not something new. Also, if he wants to take the whole thing, right, just remove the whole thing and then replace it with a different one because it's heavier or lighter, whatever it is. Whether the first one is hotter, the second one, or the other way around. Even if it wasn't if it was, let's say if it was only covered with a sheet, right, which is very thin. He can now replace it, right, with something more massive, right? But that's only when it was totally cooked. But if it's not totally cooked, even to add, right, on top of the existing cover, asur, it's not allowed to do that because you're making it cook stronger. It causes it to cook stronger, as we said. So basically, this is the summary of right, what we just learned in the Shulchan Aruch, whatever we saw in the Bet Yosef. Okay, great. I guess we'll move on. Going to hay. So it says here about impina tafshil k'dera acheret. But right, so then we said right in the tour. But what about if he removed the dish and placed it into a different pot? Right? He switched to a different pot. Then you are allowed to insulate it. So regarding that, says Bet Yosef, Gam ze besot perek kabel tumim, right? It's also there. In Gemara Shabbat. V'chen hayar Rabban Shimon Gamliel Omer that Rashbag used to say, Lo asu ela oto mecham. They only forbade that original pot, right? But if you change it, right, to switch it to a different pot, mutar, then it's allowed. So Rashi explains, right, what's the reason why? Because he says the original pot, right, that's where the rabbis decreed that he may come to, right, heat it up again with the original one. But he says, however, he can't remove it from one to another and then heat it up, right, to whatever, to insulate it. So Gemara explains the reason for this. That here we're not concerned, right? He's going to boil it again, right? To heat it up again. Because why? It's already cold. Once he moved it to a different pot, right? It's not really hot anymore. Now he's going to heat it up again. He already cooled it down. It says around over there, את הצונן, דייק מדברי הרש"י, right? He learns from this Rashi, דווקא כשפינן כדי לקרן. That's only if he moved it from one to another in order to cool it down. Cool the shara, then it's allowed. משום דלק על המגזר בהשתה, because there's no decree here anymore. We don't have nothing to decree. Tehashta okure miyaka kazwai, because if he wanted to cool it down, now he's going to heat it up. מתכוון, אחו מקם יחמלה, אבל Rambam picked out, but when it comes to Rambam, he says, Katab de'ainu tama, the reason is, according to him, the reason is because the sharet, why is it allowed? Because they only forbade to insulate on Shabbat something which is hot, which is in a kli rishon, which is in a primary pot, but that means it was on the fire. That got cooked right there. But once he moves it to a different pot, it's allowed. Just like they permitted to insulate cold things. So he says that's the main. That's the main halakha. He says that's the main opinion. Okay. Great. So let's go to Shulchan Aruch. Just give me 1 minute. I'm sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So let's see Shulchan Aruch. So it says like this: "Im pina tabshil b'Shabbat miklerat tabshil shnitbashel b'klei acher." Right. So again, right, as we said, what did he do? He moved the dish from one pot to another. So once he does that, mutar liatmino b'davar she'eno mosif habal. You're allowed to insulate it now, right, with something which doesn't add heat. Even on Shabbat, right? So what's the reason for that? As we said in the Beit Yosef, because once he moved it to a different pot to cool it down, he's not going to now heat it up again, right? So we're not concerned he's going to heat it up again. Stirring the coals, it's cooking or igniting the fire, all the kinds of stuff like that. He's not going to do that. We're not really concerned about cooking, because it's already cooked, but whatever. That's what he's saying. Okay, maybe we can try another one. We have time. Vav. So it says here in Vav, in the Torah, it's sonen mutar liatmino, right? So there's another rule which is interesting, which is you're allowed to insulate things which are already cooled down. There's no prohibition.
What's the point of insulating something if it's already cooled down?
That's the obvious question, right? So there's two possible answers you can give on that, right? One is that he's using something which adds heat. As we said, right, there are certain things that add heat. Or the other possibility is that he doesn't want it to cool down even further. So he wants to retain something there, some heat there. So let's see, right? I'm giving you two possible answers, but I'd rather see, some sources here. I'm just going to look in the tour for a second. Right. So it says here, so he says, right, you're allowed to, so there you go, right? He says that when it comes to something cold, you're allowed to insulate it in something which doesn't add heat, right? So that already eliminates one of the answers, right, that we said. For instance, he gives you an example, right? You're taking a pitcher of water and putting it under some kind of a cushion, right, or mattress. Right. So the point is, right, that you're not trying to heat it up, right? What he says is that you're trying to remove the bite of the cold from it, In other words, it should be like room temperature. So you're trying to like moderate the coldness of it. That's what he's saying. Rashbam explains, so he says that which we forbade, right, to do insulation, that's only if it didn't get to 1/3 cooked. So if you got to 1/3, then it's allowed. Rabbeinu Tam Piresh Sheyoter Ish Lechamir Be'atmana B'Mishiyah. Rabbeinu Tam says you should be more stringent with the insulation than with placing it on the fire. So he says, what's the reason why? This is because when you insulate, right, you're doing it for tomorrow, and you need more stirring the coals. They shouldn't cool down. So we're more concerned about that. Since he's doing it for tomorrow. It's forbidden. Even if it's 1/3 cooked. Okay, that's very interesting. So I'm not going to go further than this in the tour. We got to do Bet Yosef and Shulchan Aruch. So it says here the Bet Yosef brings the source for this. Mishnah Sham, right? It's a Mishnah there. What does it say there? Memale kiton benoten tachat hakar. You can fill up a pitcher with water and then put it under the cushion. Right. So in other words, what is he trying to do here? What is he trying to accomplish? It's really cold, He wants to remove the bite from it, and make it like room temperature, or like almost like lukewarm, something like that. That's what he's trying to do. That's the answer to your question. So he says, "B'amina megema." We say in Gemara, the ma'im lav dafka dehu adin letavshil shemutar l'tmino. So he says, not only water is allowed to do, you're allowed to do any dish, right, like this, to remove the coldness from it. Katav Ran, says the Ran, Rashi explains, mutar li'atmin et hatzonen, you're allowed to insulate the cold stuff. Mipnei she'achama shelo yechamu. So he says differently a little bit, right? Rashi, the reason why you want to insulate the cold stuff, because of the sun, he says, that it shouldn't heat it up. Velo gazinan atu, and we're not concerned about this. Going to come to atmanat dekadeh she'achamu. You're going to do insulation, which causes, actually to heat it up. So it seems from his words, he says, that we're insulating the cold, right, in order to heat it up. Even though he's doing it in something which doesn't add heat. So then how is he heating it up, right? That's the question. שהוא מטמין בדבר שאינו מוסיף הבל, אסור, forbidden. אבל הרמב"ם, פרק ד', right? But what about the Rambam? What does he say? He's, right, כתב, he says, מותר לטמון דבר הצונן בשבת בדבר שאינו מוסיף הבל. So he says again, right, you're allowed to insulate something which is cold in something which doesn't add heat. כדי שלא יצטנן ביותר. So why? It shouldn't get colder, he says. That's what I told you before, right? That was one of the answers. Oh, kadesh tafig, or right, just to remove the bite from it, as we said, right? The davar al sinatov, right? Remove the bite of the cold from it to make it a little bit warmer, room temperature, whatever. This is what Gaonim says. So it says that's the way it seems in all the parak here, in all chapter. We're talking about that, we're trying to heat it up. So, in other words, there is a way to insulate something, right? That the temperature should go up, because it just makes it like a warmer atmosphere. It's like similar to when we build a home, right? Whatever building, we put like insulation, in the walls, and that makes it warmer in the winter. Because it retains the heat in one place, doesn't let it dissipate. This is what it does. So insulation, when it comes to buildings, it's a very, very good thing. Insulation, it saves money, makes the house a lot more comfortable. Because in the summer it makes it cooler. And in the winter, it makes it warmer because it retains the heat. So, all right, I'll leave it at that. But so it says chapter after this, that which we said, right, it's allowed to insulate the cold stuff. So it says, but when we tell you, right, that you're allowed to insulate something cold, that's only if you don't put it, right, on top of some kind of a urn, right, hot water urn. That's not allowed. Because that's already adding heat, right? So that's something else. Katab Odaran, but it says around there, but something which adds heat, even if you're like insulating, right, something totally cold, even before Shabbat, so it's still forbidden. But so he says, what's the proof for that? What they did on the people in Tveria, right? There's a story there in the Gemara. So the rabbis forbade to them. So that was cold stuff, and it was before Shabbat. Still was forbidden. Okay, great. So I guess we'll do Shulchan Aruch next time. It's a little bit late. Hashem, thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. Laila Tov, Chazak u'Baruch, and Shabbat Shalom. So we'll see you, B'ezrat Hashem, on Sunday.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Chazak.